welcome to the University of Cincinnati. If you haven't taken a seat, I'd encourage you to. And welcome to our first Veritas Forum at the University of Cincinnati with Eric Metaxas. My name is Lydia Davis, and I am on staff with the Christian Medical and Dental Associations at the medical school, and I'm also on staff with Kenwood Baptist Church. It's great to see you all. This day could not be possible without the partnership of many different student and community organizations, and I specifically want to thank our leadership team, Jamie Noyd, Daniel Perkle, and Royce Baker. I'm also extremely grateful to my co-workers at Kenwood, friends at CPFI, and the Event Center here at TUC for all of their assistance. As we consider the topic of miracles today, I want to share a brief story. In 2009, U.S. Airways Flight 1549 made an emergency landing on the Hudson River in New York City. Images from the media portray a submerged plane with its 150 passengers standing on its wings. All of them survived. The incident became internationally known as the Miracle on the Hudson. Since then, several articles have followed up with passengers from that flight to ask how their lives were transformed as a result of experiencing this miracle. The international proclamation of this incident as a miracle and many transformed lives beg the following questions. Do miracles exist? What are they? How do you know when you've experienced one, and what is their purpose? If you experience a miracle, how should you respond? Who is behind a miracle? Is it a vague spiritual force or a personal God? In preparation for today, we asked many students, what is a miracle? We talked to skeptics and believers, scientists and artists, atheists and theists, Jews, Muslims, and Christians, and we had many interesting conversations around these yellow banners on campus. Today, we have the privilege of hearing from Eric Metaxas on this topic. Eric has written a New York Times best-selling book simply titled Miracles. Eric is a powerful communicator, and I'll leave him to share the content of his book. However, I will say, by way of introduction, that Eric's book considers the compatibility of faith and science when it asks if the existence of life and this universe is a miracle. These chapters expound on an article that he wrote for the Wall Street Journal titled, "Science Increasingly Makes a Case for God." This article is the most popular and shared piece in Wall Street Journal history to date. Eric is also known for his biographies of Dietrich Bonhoeffer and William Wilberforce, titled Bonhoeffer and Amazing Grace, respectively. He has been the guest of our last two presidents and founded the forum, Socrates in the City, a monthly event that encourages busy professionals to stop and turn off their cell phone long enough to ask the big questions of life. Please join me in welcoming Eric Metaxas to the stage.
Hello. I've never used a microphone before, pardon me. I don't know where to start. First of all, it's a thrill for me to be here. I just got the best tour of a city I've ever gotten from David Palmer, who's a pastor at Kenwood Baptist Church, where I'll be speaking tonight. And I feel like I know more about Cincinnati than I do about New York City, where I live and was born. So thank you for that. I particularly enjoy speaking at universities. I don't get to do it all that often because I hate young people. It's just a thing. No, I don't get to do it that often, but every time I do go to university, I feel the beauty of university and the beauty of being young is that theoretically you're open to new ideas, you're open to truth. If you're not, you're old. Even though you're young, you're old. It's important to be open to the idea of the truth, to the idea, not just the idea of the truth, but to the concept of truth, because there would be plenty of people who would say, like, well, there's no such thing as truth. Your truth is your truth. My truth is my truth. I like to kill people on weekends. Who are you to judge? That's that, right? Some uncomfortable laughs. Any murderers, would you like to confess now? Not that there's anything wrong with murder. Who am I to say what's right or wrong? You know, in these topsy-turvy times, everything's cool. So, I want to thank Dr. Ono for inviting me, for allowing me to speak to you. And I noticed that, the title, I walked around and I see all these posters and things, and it says, "Do you believe in miracles?" And I guess my answer to that, if I only get one word answer, would be, nah. I'm kidding. I do believe in miracles. I do believe in miracles. But it's interesting because I'm also very skeptical. And I think that's why I love the idea of asking what is truth, what it really, using our minds in the finest way that we can to determine whether something is just emotion or coincidence or whatever. Because people often use the word miracle, for example, too lightly. And I'll be honest with you, no kidding, but the quote-unquote miracle on the Hudson that you just described, Lydia, where the plane landed and all that stuff, I do not think of that as a miracle. I think of it as a glorious, happy blessing that everyone should be thankful for, and that lives could be changed, and most lives would be changed. But I wouldn't necessarily say it's a miracle. I would say that it was an incredibly competent pilot who, by God's grace, was able to do what he had been trained to do, and he didn't need to do that. It didn't need to go that way. So part of me sees it as a miracle in the sense that it could have gone badly, right? But I don't, when it automatically happened and people say miracle, I thought that's kind of the bastardized, dumbed down idea of miracle that has come into the culture, right? Like anything amazing is a miracle. Well, that's not really what a miracle is. There are amazing things that happen, and you really need to have an ability to think about it critically. I guess I wanted to tell you a little bit about my story to give you some context. And so you'll understand kind of where I'm coming from, okay? So my story is this. I was born I was born in New York City, in Queens. My dad is from Greece. My mom is from Germany. If you are raised Greek and German, that means you will be raised Greek, exactly. Last night, by the way, no joke, last night, I was in New York City with my wife at the New York City premiere of My Big Fat Greek Wedding 2. Yeah, that's how Greek I am. And it was pretty amazing. There was like big star. Tom Hanks was there. He didn't say hello, but I don't like him anyway. So his wife Rita Wilson was there, and it was a big deal. But it kind of underscores that for Greeks, in a way, most Greeks who come to America, for them, like their number one hobby is being Greek. Like, I want you to think about that. Like, if you're Greek, you get this, but it's sort of like ethnic identity is so big for them, okay? I was raised Greek. So we went to Greek Orthodox Church. Like, we weren't going to go to some German Lutheran church. I don't think so, no. We went to the Greek Orthodox Church, and so I was raised effectively Greek. My last name's Greek, so you kind of get this cultural experience, and the cultural experience often centers around the church. But the reason I say this is that even though it was a wonderful, My Big Fat Greek Wedding kind of cultural experience, except I was considered a half-breed, so it was kind of painful too. Can you see the pain on my face? It's sort of true, right? When they find out your mother's German, like, oh, yeah. But the point is, it was a wonderful community, but it was mostly a Greek community, okay? Now, you all know what cultural Christianity is. Some of you might know what cultural Islam is. There's a lot of groups that they sort of have this, I know people that they say, yeah, I'm Muslim. It's like, they're not that Muslim. Like, they're just from a country where they do the Muslim thing, but they're not into being Muslim. If you start grilling them on the Islam doctrine of Islam, they don't really know it. They just know they're not Jewish, they're not Christian, they're not atheists, so like, I'm a Muslim, yeah, whatever, but they're not into it. Tons of so-called Christians that are like that. I was one of them growing up. And it doesn't make me a bad person. It just made my brother a bad person, actually. But it just means you're growing up in this warm community that I would call religious in the traditional sense. They're not actually like breaking it down. Here's what we believe. We take this really seriously. At Easter, in a couple of weeks, the Greeks go crazy saying Christos Anesti, right? You know what that means? Happy St. Patrick's Day. It means Christ is risen, right? But they declare it. And then the rejoinder is alithos anesti, truly he is risen, right? I said that a zillion times growing up. And when I say a zillion, maybe not a zillion, but like half a zillion. Like you sing it over and over and over and over. And so does everyone who's Greek. They all go to church on Easter, whether they are communist atheists or whatever it is. Like everybody goes to church on Easter, they participate in this. But the issue is this. When I went to college, and I had the fortune and misfortune of going to Yale University, which is a very secular institution, like aggressively secular, I realized that I had no clue if I actually believe Christos Anesti. Like, wait, a corpse was reanimated 2,000 years ago, and like we know this and base our lives on that. I don't know. Like, I'm not going to laugh at it. I was never one of those people that would like scorn it. But neither was I going to say like, oh yeah, no, that's true. I believe that. I honestly didn't know. But I always considered myself a Christian, right? But once I got to Yale, I started realizing I don't really know what I believe. And for the first time in my life, I'm being challenged by people, who don't believe what the people around me growing up seem to believe, even though if you ask them today, they don't know themselves. It's a cultural environment. And they were never challenged to think about these truth claims. They were never challenged to say, do you really believe this? That a personal God that like can speak English, that knows your name, created the universe, like every atom in the universe? Do you believe that? I think it's legitimate to say that that's hard to believe, okay? And I think you need to start there. It might not have been hard to believe a long, long time ago. But in this day and age, it is hard to believe. It should be hard to believe, and it should challenge us to actually think about it and to say, am I basing my life, if you're a Christian, am I basing my life on something that's simply not true, or is it true on some mythical level? A lot of the mainline liberal denominations, like mainline denominations, which have really all swung liberal, I mean, whether it's Methodist, Episcopalian, whatever, they've kind of fudged this in what I think of as a totally I guess hypocritical, really, I would say, way by saying things like, oh, Jesus rose in the hearts of his disciples, which means precisely bubkiss. That's an English word that I picked up in New York. I mean, that's like saying, I mailed you the check in my mind. Really, I believe that I mailed the check to you in my mind. Or let me get that package for you, metaphorically. When somebody says Jesus rose in the hearts of his disciples, those are what we call weasel words. Do you know what weasel words means? Do you understand that? No, you don't. Weasel words comes from, like 150 years ago. They believed that weasels would suck the insides of eggs out. They'd go into the chicken coops and suck the inside of the egg out, and then you'd get an egg, but there's nothing in it, right? Weasel words are like that. It's like this nice term, and then you realize it means nothing, right? So Jesus rose in the hearts of his disciples is a joke, and it should be mocked and laughed at. Like, if you don't believe Jesus rose bodily from the dead, I say you skip the Jesus thing. That's my advice. Because it becomes silly. It's like, oh, he was a wonderful teacher. That's really not reasonable to conclude, okay? If he says, I'm going to be killed and I'm going to rise from the dead and I'm God and I can, heal the blind and raise the dead and I mean, that person would be considered crazy, not like a great sage, right? So I didn't come up with this concept, by the way, it's C.S. Lewis, but how many of you knew that already and you were already making fun of me? I know. But the point is that the idea that we can kind of have our cake and eat it too, you can't have your cake and eat it too. In fact, in Scripture, Paul, who knew a little bit about what he was talking about, said, if Jesus did not rise from the dead, then our whole faith is in vain. He was honest about it. He said, skip it. unless it actually happened. But it's hard for us to believe that it happened, and again, it should be hard for us to believe that it happened. If you go, oh, I have no problem with that, you should have a problem with that. People don't rise from the dead. Have you been paying attention to corpses? It doesn't happen. So if it happened, you would say, well, then there's only one explanation. That's a miracle. Like, it's an actual miracle. I don't have an explanation. There's a God outside of the universe capable of doing things like this. There's no natural explanation. So I bring a skepticism because, in the course of my life, I became a Christian around my 25th birthday, and it was through a miraculous experience that I came to faith. Up to that point, I was sure you could not know whether there's a God. I thought that the most intelligent, educated people would, if they were really honest, would say, I don't know. And so people who claim that they know, I said they're deluded. I don't think you can know. But I had this experience around my 25th birthday where I had a dream, and it's a long story. You can look it up on my website. It's free, it's short, but I tell the story, and it was a mind-blowing dream. It was so mind-blowing that I woke up totally different than the person who had gone to sleep. I said, it's game over. I believe in Jesus. I believe in the Bible. It doesn't mean I was comfortable with it. But it's no different than if whoever you talk to this morning, if somebody were to try to persuade you that person doesn't exist, you might go through the mental game with them of saying, like, well, it's possible that they're a robot, or it's possible that I ate something and I hallucinated it, but is it really? Like, you'd be playing head games because you know that's stupid. Like, you actually talked to that person, so you can't pretend. After this happened to me, I could no longer pretend. I could have conversations. I still have an infinity of questions. But once I had this experience, which was this miraculous experience, and I've had a number of others, not a zillion, but a small number, that I would say rise to the level of bona fide miracles that are just staggering, where you just think, what happened, what just happened? And so it kind of changed everything for me, as I say, around my 25th birthday. And so that experience made me, in a way, go back, because now I had all my friends from Yale who were going to think I lost my mind, and, what happened to poor Eric? He used to be so much fun. And I said, I really want to understand, is there anything believable about this? I mean, like, it's as if, imagine if tonight, okay, you wake up in your room, and Jesus appears to you in the room, and you have a conversation with him, and you know that it happened, okay? Tomorrow, you've got problems. You understand what I'm saying? Like, you've got problems. Because, like, if you actually know that it happened, you can't pretend it didn't happen, but now you've got to go through life with this new information, which is very disturbing. What are you going to do, right? So that's effectively what happened to me. And so I started reading books just to kind of find out, like, I didn't really believe... I didn't even know how to read the Bible, right? I thought, like, what's metaphorical, what's literal? A lot of times people really, really sloppily say, like, I don't take the Bible literally. Well, that's good, because not all of it is meant to be taken literally. When Jesus said, I am the door, he didn't mean I swing on hinges, and you need to believe that, otherwise you're going to hell. You understand? No? Okay, let me explain. A door has hinges. So you have to really be part of a community that's intellectually curious and healthy, that's emotionally healthy, to try to understand this faith thing, and to try to understand, are there things that people say I have to believe, which I don't in fact have to believe? Because there are people that will come up to you and say, you must believe that the Bible says that we were all created 8,000 years ago, and blah, 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 blah. And I'm here to say, like, you can debate it, you can talk about it, but that's not something you must believe, right? And people often add stuff and make it seem, well, if you don't believe that, you're out. So I was curious to think, so what do I believe? What is true? Really, what it boils down to, but this should boil down to the same thing for you, whether you believe or you don't, is simply what is true, right? You use science, you use observation, you do whatever you can to find out what is true, what is the nature of reality. And my thinking is, whatever that nature is, I'm good with it. because I believe that God created reality, and whatever it is, like I'm not going to think like, oh no, my faith is ruined because I just discovered whatever, Like I don't really think that anything like that has ever happened as far as the Christian faith goes. But years ago, if you think about the latter part of the 19th century, there were people who believed that unless you believe Adam and Eve were created literally a few thousand years ago, you're saying the Bible is untrue and the whole thing falls apart. And so you got people kind of doubling down on that idea. And then you got other people just blowing the whole thing off, saying like it's clearly been disproved now. Science has disproved, the Christian faith and the Bible as ridiculous. And then you had other people, I was talking before, kind of like the mainline denominations trying to fudge it and say like, well, we believe, we just want you to be a good person, and we believe Jesus rose in the hearts of his disciples, and we don't think Mary had to be born, or Jesus had to be born of a virgin, or had to walk on the water. That's a metaphor for hockey, I don't know, something. But the point is, something happened in history where science, of course, made so many advances that people of serious faith were kind of knocked back on their heels, like, how do we respond to this? And some of them, unfortunately, really doubled down on a lot of dumb stuff that there's no reason you have to believe that. There's no, so you can see that it's sort of complicated. But I think the irony, the tremendous irony, is that by the time you get, let's say, to the 1960s, the narrative that science has pushed faith out of the picture was very strong, right? Science is, putting men on the moon, and science, by the way, obviously is sexist. I got to point that out because no women were put on the moon. So if you're a scientist, you understand you are by definition a sexist, right? I'm just saying. So that's one reason that I hate science and I think it's stupid, and I reject it totally. But that's how people think sometimes, isn't it? Like they find one thing about religion or some kind of, and then the whole thing's stupid. Imagine if you found some things about science, which you could in 10 minutes, that don't make sense, right? There are plenty of scientists who violently disagree with each other, top scientists who argue about the nature of evolution, right? And that's not the kind of thing you're going to see played out in the cultural conversation. But imagine if you find out, like, they don't even know what they think. And then you think about how, Einstein totally blew apart the Newtonian version of things, and somebody's going to come along and blow apart Einstein. Like, they don't know what's going on. I think science is stupid. Right? I mean, it just makes sense. And plus, I've met some scientists who are really mean to me. So I just hate all science. You would say, Eric, listen, we respect your experiences. We get it that biology teacher, beat you with a Bunsen burner, and which he stole from the chemistry teacher, and he was just a bad dude. But don't reject biology and chemistry because of that. That's not logical. But when it comes to faith stuff, we tend not to be logical in the way that we require ourselves to be logical with everything else. We just don't do that. We kind of act like it's a separate reality, and if you want to believe in it, that's nice for you. Or if you believe in it, you're an idiot. But we don't say all reality is one. And if there is such a thing as a reality that we can't see, which, by the way, science believes anyway, right? Once you get into quantum physics and things get really weird. And so, but the narrative that science had, like, eclipsed, quote unquote, faith was very powerful in the culture for a while. And some of you have heard of the God of the gaps theory, right? In other words, that science rather pompously said, well, faith is for people who just, like, we haven't figured out this or this or this. And so they just say, oh, God did it. God caused the lightning. But now we know the lightning is caused by, ionized particles, blah, blah, blah. So we don't need God anymore. And every time we discover something, we're kind of pushing God further and further into the corner. And of course, eventually, we're not going to need God anymore, right? Well, you can understand how people would think that way. But the problem is that beginning, you could say in the 60s, there's no exact date, but that the narrative began to shift, where science more and more was giving evidence that there might in fact be a creator or a designer of the universe, for example. That's to use an example, right? So in 60 something, Carl Sagan. How many people have heard of Carl Sagan? I'm curious. So fair amount of you. But I mean, he died a number of years ago. But he was like Mr. Science for the 1970s and 80s probably, and he was a Cornell scientist and a popularizer of science. And but in the 60s, he came up with this idea that there are only really two major criteria necessary for life to be able to exist on a planet. It needs to be, this far away from a star and whatever else, whatever. So if you figure out how many planets there are in the known universe, there's got to be tons of planets that have life on them. It just goes to figure, not a problem. Well, that makes it really, really sound like life just shows up anywhere and everywhere rather normally. But as time passed, like almost every month, science came up with a new discovery that said, no, in order for that kind of a planet to exist, you also need this and this and this. So those of you who know math know that the number of possible planets to support life plummets every time you discover one more thing. It's like everything multiplied by that. And then there were 20, right? So again, you do the math on that. It's this times this times this times this times this times this. I mean, the odds start coming way, 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 way down. Still, billions of planets that could potentially hold life. But next thing you know, it's millions of planets and thousands of planets. And according to what I was reading, I read, when I first came to faith, I started reading these books by a guy named Hugh Ross, Caltech astrophysicist, who was reading the Bible. This is like one of these freaky geniuses, polymaths. Like he's not just an astrophysicist. He's also, he knows more about biology than anyone you'll ever meet and whatever. And so he kind of, as he was reading the Bible, he came to faith because it corroborated his scientific view of the universe. Like he was looking to disprove it or whatever. Anyway, he started writing these books about what is called the fine-tuned argument. Some of you familiar with this, right? That many, many scientists say, yes, there are so many things that had to be fine-tuned just so for the Earth, for example, to exist and enable us to breathe oxygen. I mean, imagine, like, you're just breathing the atmosphere right now. This is not, like, specially pumped in for you by the university, right? I mean, it's kind of astounding that there's an infinity of things that have to combine for a planet to be this hospitable to life, and not just to life, but to life being able to evolve and on and on and on. And so science said over the years that, yes, that now there's this and there's this and this and this. And so in this book that I read by Hugh Ross, he does the math, and it's really freaky. He makes it clear that, at some point, let's say there were billions of planets that could support life. And every time you add another factor, right, that number goes down by, a factor of 10 or whatever it is. But at some point, because we now know the size of the universe, it's not infinite, time is not infinite, we only have 13.8 billion years if you buy into the Big Bang model, which most scientists do. So you start realizing, like, hey, like, we can figure this out, like, on a calculator. It's not that tough. And so the numbers went down and down and down and down until, just to freak you out, which I love doing, by the way. I hope you're freaked out by this. The numbers went down to where, instead of saying, like, oh, there should be 1,000 planets in the universe that could support life just like Earth, that it went down to 100 and to 10, and then pretty much went down to 0 and to below 0. In other words, the more you knew about what was necessary for life to exist, and I know I'm speaking vaguely, you can read my Miracles book, and then you can read the books that I refer to in the Miracles book to do the math on this. But top scientists who are not Christians corroborate this. They go, yes, this is, like, weird. This is kind of scary to us, right? It doesn't fit the narrative. But the idea is that not only shouldn't there be much life in the universe, according to all of these parameters, there should not be any. Like, the odds against even one planet creating oxygen so we can kind of sit here and hang out and take it for granted, is like 1 in quintillion. And then they find something else, and it's 1 in septillion, and it goes on and on and on and on. Scientists like, what's his name, Hoyle, who came up with the term Big Bang, he was like freaked out by some of these things that he discovered in science that were so fine-tuned. Now, he was an atheist, and he never changed, but he was himself freaked out by, he didn't say freaked out, because freaked out had not been invented yet as a term, but I think he said he was greatly troubled or something like that. Or vexed, terribly vexed. I don't know. But he was horrified, let's just say, because it didn't make sense. He said it looked like a super intellect had monkeyed with the physics and the chemistry and the biology. It gave him pause. It made him tremble. So I put this in my book, Miracles, because I said, the narrative has shifted over these decades. You've got a lot of scientists who know this stuff, who believe this stuff. Theoretically, 40% of scientists believe in some kind of God. Now, you'd never get that from the cultural narrative. We've bought into this narrative that it's like science is pitted against faith, and that's that. That's simply not true. But as I say, as time has passed, and as we have learned more from science, many more scientists have felt that it's okay for them to have some kind of faith. It seems usually to be physicists who find faith or believe in some kind of God. So this evidence keeps coming out. So I said, I've got to put it in my Miracles book. Why? Because if you're talking about something that is that absurd, you talk about something that should not happen. The creation of the universe is infinitely beyond something like the parting of the Red Sea or somebody being raised from the dead. Like, those are little jokes compared to when you're talking about creating the universe ex nihilo against all these odds. I mean, it's as if there are 200 dials on the wall, and they all have to be calibrated perfectly so that if they're if one of them is a millimeter off, the whole thing is gone. So you say, what are the odds of that? And the odds are just, 1 followed by like 100 zeros. I mean, it's something on the level of it's absolutely not supposed to happen, right? So when Christopher Hitchens was asked, what is the number one argument on the other side, in other words, arguing for the existence of God, what would you say, Christopher Hitchens? He said, without a doubt, the fine-tuned argument. That's the one that gives me pause. There's no question about it. It's a very powerful argument, and I would bet that most of my colleagues on the atheist side would agree that that is the one that stops us. We're not sure what to say. It's, okay, so it didn't make him a Christian, but it really gave him pause. So when I took those chapters in my Miracles book and boiled it down and sent it to the Wall Street Journal, hoping they'd publish it, they published it, they changed the title to Science Increasingly Makes the Case for God, which is a little more provocative than I wanted to be. I was just sort of raising the issue. But it went viral, as they say, and it has now amassed over 600,000 Facebook likes. Like that. That's fairly funny that you're applauding that. That's just funny. It's a beautiful metric. Please applaud. But when you think about it, what does that prove? That it is by a factor of twice, okay, the most popular article, the most shared article in the history of the Wall Street Journal since they've kept these records, right? What does that tell you? Does it tell you that my writing is unbelievable? Partially it does. Partially. Grant me that. But what it tells you is that there is a hunger in the United States of America, in the West. We want to discuss this. We want to think about this without ideologues beating us over the head and saying, you're stupid if you believe anything. You're stupid if you don't believe anything. Why don't we just care about truth? And why don't we try to take our emotions out of it? And just as you would not say, I think science is stupid, you wouldn't say, I think the possibility that there is something beyond this universe is stupid. Because in fact, science, by its own definition, cannot really weigh in on that. I mean, you realize science can only describe what is part of this universe, the time and space, and speculations beyond that are itself, themselves by definition, unscientific. So the most healthy thing that science can say is, we don't know. Here's what we think, but we don't know. So that's the ultimate question, isn't it? Is there something beyond space and time? Is there something beyond the universe created 13.8 billion years ago? Is there something beyond it that does not partake of it, that is outside space and time? Now, it seems to me that there is, and it seems to me that there's evidence that there is. Now, remember, evidence, truth, rationality is bigger than science, right? There are certain things that can't be reproduced in a lab, right? We can't go back in time and try to reproduce the creation or reproduce the existence of Jesus and put him in a tomb and see if he rises again. We can't really do that. So it's just like in a court of law, you don't scientifically prove things in a court of law, but you say, what about the person giving this testimony? Is this person somebody who lies? Is this person somebody who is trustworthy? Is this person a paragon of their community that everyone says, no, that's a wise person, you've got to at least take seriously what that person says? That's what we do with this kind of stuff, right? It's not sheerly scientific. This is certainly not to denigrate science, but what I'm saying is you do that in a court of law. There's ballistics and there's forensics, there's science, but ultimately it could come down to several people say this happened, and either those people are trustworthy or those people have reasons to maybe not be trustworthy. We use our minds every day to think things through, to be logical and rational, and we need to do the same when it comes to faith. And it's become my understanding over the years that there is overwhelming evidence for what the Bible says, for the idea that there's something beyond the universe, that there's a God beyond the universe, that miracles happen today. There is stunning evidence. Now, you might dismiss the evidence, or you might say, well, that seems compelling and that seems not so compelling. But the point is, we ought to be able to talk about that rationally, right? So in my book, Miracles, which, by the way, I didn't want to write, I think usually the best books are the ones that people didn't want to write. I had an editor in New York, and I kind of had lunch with him, and I told him this miracle story from my life, and I'm not going to tell it now because we don't really have time. And my miracle stories and the ones in the book, they're always a little complicated, and I'll tell you, that's kind of the point. In other words, you need to know the context. You need to really set up the context before you can judge whether it was a miracle, okay? Like the guy who landed on the Hudson, if he was out of his mind drunk and that happened, I think that would be a miracle. Do you hear what I'm saying? Okay, if he was dead in the cockpit and the plane landed that way, that's more evidence like, whoa, I think it's a miracle, okay? If people inside the plane, several of them said they saw angels, I would say, wow, well, we got to take that seriously. Several of them said it, independent of each other. Some of them are Christians, some of them are not. I mean, we need to be able to think these things through. What is a miracle? What is not? So when I look at the creation of the universe, ex nihilo, it seems to me something that I can say is miraculous. You don't have to agree with it, but I think that we ought to be able to make the case and say, what do you make? Some people, let's face it, really think with their emotions. And it's particularly bad when somebody who is scientific is thinking with their emotions. When they just say, I hate those stupid Christian people, they abused me as a kid, so I don't really care what their stupid evidence is, right? That's unhealthy. We need to be able to look at this coldly. The truth is everybody's truth. There's not such thing as Christian truth and scientific truth. There's just truth, whatever it is, okay? And I've never seen a Christian apple, for example. Have you seen a Christian apple? It's an apple, right? Now, if God is God and if Jesus is the Lord of the universe, then every electron in the apple is spinning around the nucleus by the grace of Jesus. Like, that's nice, but it doesn't make it a Christian apple, okay? It's just an apple. And I think we have to stop thinking in those categories because it sets up a war, and we don't need that. We simply need to know what is true. So I say that the more science learns, and this is the narrative that has shifted, and most scientists themselves are not really unaware of how dramatically it's shifted. but that science is in fact pointing toward the possibility or the idea even that there is a designer who designed the universe. Again, it doesn't mean that it proves it, but we didn't say that we know the theory of evolution is true, or we know that. In other words, you say this seems like what it looks like. This is a model that seems to work, and the more time passes, the more it seems to work. So let's keep looking at it, and let's be honest about what the holes are in the argument, and so on and so forth. We need to apply that, I think, to this idea of whether there is something beyond the universe. But I do think that narrative has shifted, and so I thought that is, for my money, the biggest miracle, if there ever was a miracle, is the creation of the universe. And I don't just mean the creation of this planet, but the creation of the universe in the Big Bang, the four fundamental forces, being set in stone less than a millionth of a second after the Big Bang. That's pretty quick. But that if the ratio between any of them was ever so slightly different, there's no universe. There's there's no universe, there's no planets, it's fascinating. You think, how did it get to be like, now, that's a larger conversation, but that to me is the biggest miracle ever, and the biggest lie ever is the idea that there's this war between science and faith. That's a lie. It's just stupid. You need to say that maybe you don't believe and maybe I believe, but this idea that the two are somehow at odds, if there is a God, we're talking about the God who created the universe, who created the laws of physics, the laws of nature. That's not a bearded dude in the sky who kind of grants magic wishes. We're talking about something that we should take seriously. Also, I think that the evidence that I have had just from friends, that friends have told me stories. I have experienced what I would call miracles. Friends of mine have told me stories that are just totally mind-blowing. Now, I know these people. I put the stories in the book on purpose because I said, I want to know who these people are. I don't want to just find stuff on the internet and say that's interesting. I want to know the source, just like you would in a court of law, because I know that that person is not crazy. They don't lie. They're not looking to get attention, So I put like about 30 miracle stories in the book, which for me is a kind of evidence, right? It's like science is a kind of evidence and that kind of thing. They're all different kinds of evidence, but I put them in the book with the idea that it's something to consider, that we need to be able to consider it. And so on the one hand, there are people who just sneer at it, and I cannot take those people seriously intellectually. If you sneer at it and dismiss it out of hand, I cannot take you intellectually seriously. You've got a chip on your shoulder about faith. It's not fair to be that way. In the same way that it is not fair for many people of faith to say that everything's a miracle or that God did this or God did that. And God did, on the one hand, God does everything. On the other hand, finding the parking space did not need to be the eternal God opening up the parking space for you. And you have to be careful that there are many wonderful things and wonderful blessings, and when you say it's a miracle, I think what happens is you denigrate the idea of miracle. And again, in our culture, that's what we do. The Mets won the 1969 World Series. People say, oh, it's the miracle Mets. That's a pop cultural view of miracle, okay? But, they had Tom Seaver, Jerry Koosman. They had a lot going on for them, so it didn't need to be that kind of a miracle. I've just dated myself, I guess. So I think we have to be skeptical as believers, and we have to understand that when you say to somebody, I believe Jesus rose from the dead bodily, you should not expect somebody to say, yeah, I think that could happen. It could not happen. It's stupid, unless it actually happened, in which case it's one of the greatest miracles in the history of the universe. But it's not just like, well, yeah, it happened. That's what I've always been taught. It doesn't make sense unless it actually happened. And then you've got some problems. You've got to figure out, how is it possible that could happen? Is there possibility that there is a God outside of time and space who can inject himself into time and space in that way? Is that possible? I would say it is. I would say it surely is. But I don't think we should pretend like that's not a big deal. It is a big deal. Anomalies are meant to be seen as anomalous, not as no big deal. We also have to ask, what is a miracle? Okay, I say that, on the one hand, everything is a miracle, but we're not talking about that kind of miracle, right? If God created the universe ex nihilo, and if every particle is, under his sway at all times, that's all a miracle that we kind of don't see as a miracle, I guess, unless you really study and study and study, and then you're in awe of it. But when we talk about miracles, we're talking about something like the parting of the Red Sea, right? And you have to ask yourself, okay, if that actually happened, if the God of the universe did that, why would he do it that way? Could he not have rescued the Israelites in a less dramatic fashion? I think he could have. But why didn't he? He did it the way he did it specifically to draw attention to himself. Miracles, in the New Testament word semeion, it's a sign from God. God is trying to speak to you through circumstances and to say, look, I am here. It's kind of like he opens up the curtain and says, I am here. You didn't know, I am here. Parting the Red Sea is like that. It was a way of saying to the Israelites, you doubted me? Well, now you've got problems because I just parted the Red Sea. I saved your rear ends. You're going to remember this every year for thousands and thousands of years. That's how dramatic a miracle it was, right? That's a miracle. Why did Lazarus get raised from the dead? Jesus could have cured him when he had the sniffles. He did not do that. Did you know that Lazarus had the sniffles? In the original Greek, that's the word. But the point is, Jesus chose not to do that. Jesus chose to let him get sick and sicker and die, and not just die, but be in the tomb for 4 days. Why? So that when he stood there and said, Lazarus come forth, and the stench comes out of the tomb, and Lazarus walks out, everybody says, that is a miracle. Everybody's out of their minds with disbelief. Who is this Jesus? He did that specifically to point to himself, to say, yes, I have power over life and death. That's what miracles are. Miracles are God's way of speaking to us. So if something amazing happens and it doesn't point you to the God of the Bible, I would say, I don't know that that's a miracle, or, it's a miracle that you missed. And that happens too. Miracles happen, and people just go, yeah, I don't know. God does, the universe does funny things. I think the point of a miracle is the God outside of the universe trying to speak with those who are inside the universe in a way to say, like, I'm here. Anyway, that's really all we have time for. I wanted to leave a couple of minutes for Q&A, so I'll take any questions you have, and thank you for listening this long. I prefer true or false questions.
Most of the people that I know who have experienced miracles feel like it's a very personal thing, and perhaps they just are ashamed or worried that people will laugh at them.
Or yes, it's called cowardly. Go ahead.
Right. So if it's to point to God, what is our responsibility to actually tell the story?
Yes, I was kidding, but of course I'm always only half kidding, because I know people who have experienced insane miracles, people with tremendous credibility, and they won't talk about it. And I get angry at them, because I know that there are people whose lives would be changed if they opened their mouth, but they're afraid of losing their job. And I would say to them, who gave you your job, okay? The God who did that miracle gave you your job, and guess what? He probably gave you that job so that you would open your mouth and share it with a colleague or something like that. Every human being is hungry for the transcendent, for truth. I mean, if this is true and not just hallucination, who is not hungry to think, that's amazing, that challenges my paradigm. I have to think about that. And so I do really believe, based on writing this book, Miracles, I have come to believe that the Christian faith and the Bible is not only rational, but it is, in my estimation, so rational that to not believe it, those people ought to be on the intellectual defensive at this point. And I'm not saying this to say rah, rah, but I'm just saying that really it's gotten to a point where it's ridiculous, but most people who believe know so little about the reasonability of what we believe that they're shy and they don't want to be, I don't want to proselytize, and I think, you don't want to proselytize? That's like saying you've got a ton of food in your pocket, there's some hungry people over there, and you don't want to offend them by giving them a roll. I don't get that. Either you have food or you don't. If you don't believe you have food, then let's face it, you don't really believe that it's good news or that anybody really needs to hear it. Or maybe the version you've been given is such a bummer religious version, it's all about it, you're going to go to hell or something like that, that of course you don't want to share it. But if what you have is actually good news, that there's a God who created the universe, who knows you personally, who loves you and has a plan for your life, not to embarrass you and to make you a religious freak, but to make you more human and more wonderful, if that is true, and there's any way that you can help somebody else see it, what kind of a monster would you be not to try? I mean, let's be blunt. We're going to be judged when we get to heaven. God's going to hold us accountable for what we know. If you're blessed to be a blessing. I'd say the same thing about the United States of America. This country is so blessed, it's to bless the rest of the world, however you want to define that. We're not supposed to hoard our blessings. And I'm not talking about immigration policy, but I'm just talking generally, if you have money, if you have talent, if you have beauty, if you have power, whatever you have that is good, I believe is a gift from God, which he gives us to use for others. So if God has given you a story or something amazing, I just am flabbergasted that people would keep it to themselves. And so part of the reason I wrote the book and have all these miracle stories in it and talk about the reasonability of faith and science is to say to people, folks, the time is short. Like, let's stop kidding around. If this is true, and it seems to me overwhelmingly true, you ought to acquaint yourself with it and be talking about it and stop apologizing because you're around hostile idiots. I mean, because you're around hostile people, that's their issue. I mean, why do we say like, oh yeah, that was really bad of me to try to share Jesus with somebody? Was it? Maybe it's bad of them to be so sneering and dismissive, and maybe it shows that they're even more wounded and you should pray for them even more. But I really think that the church in America has gotten so namby-pamby, I can't think of a better word, I hate that term, but it's scandalous is what it is. And I think that people are hungry. I mean, the Facebook likes on that article proved to me the hunger. People are just want to know what's the story. And if we can give them a little piece of the story, I would say we're obligated to do that. But maybe we don't believe it enough ourselves. I think, first of all, we have to understand, like, no, this is true, and this is amazing and wonderful. We have to first convince ourselves of what is true before we're going to share it. So, are we wrapping up? All right, well, thank you very much.